Layla was an immigrant woman from the Middle East. As a driven, educated woman, she contacted me because she faced many obstacles on her path to leadership. Communication, trust, confidence, and saying no were among her biggest challenges. In this episode, I share parts of her journey through our 2-year partnership and the insights that helped her become an effective leader. So go ahead, grab your cup of tea and join me in this episode of Empowering Conversations. Hello and welcome to the Empowering Conversations podcast, a place to get inspired, challenged, and empowered by stories of immigrants who build their success from zero. I'm your host, Mehran. She received her first offer in the States verbally. Ecstatic, she thought to herself, hard work finally paid off. Now I could get my green card and visit my family. That's all she could think of while the manager gave the specifics on salary, responsibilities, and title, while explaining the opportunities for her growth. She knew the manager a bit and was not his biggest fan, but liked the project his lab was working on. So she set aside their differences and decided to work under his supervision anyways. A week later, Layla received another offer letter with a better salary and a more stable job in a company. She was wanted, not only by one, but by 2 institutions. She proudly declined the offer because she had already committed herself. But that was verbally. Unaware, she put all her efforts on preparing for her new role. When she visited the supervisor to discuss the specifics of first day and signed the formal contract, the manager took back his words. He claimed the conversation was a misunderstanding and he didn't have the funds to support her. She froze in the chair. Tears started rolling down her eyes. How could he take back his words? By now, either you're thinking what a jerk the boss was, or how naive and ill-informed Layla was. How could someone commit to that degree without a signed contract? And I'm sure a group of you are thinking, did she have any email? Anything in writing? To use it as a proof? A way to fight? Unfortunately, she didn't. When Layla called me, she was crying. How could I do that? It's my fault. I should have asked for the written contract. But was she completely wrong? I mean, if she was back home, this would have not happened. She would have started her job based on the conversation and the salary promised. Growing up in Iran, Layla learned to honor her verbal promises, just like a written document. So you might imagine the frustration she felt because of seeing someone break his promise. She was heartbroken. According to Geert Hofstede, every person carries within him or herself patterns of thinking, feeling, and potential acting that were learned through their lifetime. Much of it has been acquired in early childhood, because at that time, a person is most susceptible to learning and assimilating. And once learned, unlearning these values and patterns are hard. For her, it was a case of cultural misunderstanding. Now, let me explain what a cultural misunderstanding is. That's when 2 people from different cultures meet, but they cannot communicate in a way that both leave the discussion on the same page. Now, the question is, who's right? Well, no one. Today, we're not talking about right or wrong. We're talking about awareness, about how to communicate successfully to limit cultural misunderstandings that result into culture shocks. We know culture has a collective nature and is learned at a young age. We also know once we immigrate and immerse ourselves in the new culture, misunderstandings are bound to happen. And culture shock is something all of us immigrants experience to a degree. But we hope by creating awareness, we can reduce the incidence and facilitate the integration process. When I talk with my friends and clients like Layla, I give them 3 options. Complain about a situation, fight with it, or adapt to it. If they choose to complain about it, I ask them to come back when they are done complaining. Complaining and I rarely go hand in hand. To me, complaining is the stage that you feel powerless to do what you want to do. Complaining comes from a place that you don't take responsibility and ownership for your actions and your mistakes. That's when you are the victim to the circumstances. And I strongly believe, regardless of the situation, we always have a choice to make. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes we can't change the circumstances, like Layla's. She couldn't go back and ask the manager to send her the formal contract before declining the other one. But what she could do was to change her attitude about it and improve her relationship with the new boss. Because at the end, she signed another contract with him and he became her boss. Granted, she was receiving a lower salary and a limited growth opportunity, but she didn't mind. While money was important, it was not her major concern. Like many other immigrants, she lived with less. But the only thing she had difficulty with was her lack of trust and the issues raised from that. While she was working with him, she showed maximum flexibility and did as the supervisor ordered. But she was not passionate about the projects anymore. She found herself disengaged, and the team noticed that. In her one-on-ones with her boss, he started giving her suggestions to improve her performance. The list grew longer by weeks. She needed to work on her communication skills, her writing skills, way to explain and present her data. All of it. They considered her a procrastinator. Her boss wanted her to be more proactive in solving problems. She needed to build her leadership ability and so much more. None of which she could do if she didn't trust him and strengthen the relationship. In other words, overcome her cultural shock. And I will tell you in a minute why that's important. Living in the States, Layla was experiencing a cultural misunderstanding, something that all immigrants experience along their journey. In almost every episode, my guests talk extensively about the issues they faced, their lessons, and the parts of the culture they had to unlearn to succeed in the new country. Cleanthus on 10th episode talked about how his loud voice and his enthusiasm as an immigrant CEO resulted into numerous misunderstandings. Some perceived him as dominant and overbearing when he was only being a typical Greek. Azita on 14th episode assumed the role of housewife based on her culture. But a tragedy made her become an independent woman in the States. Fred in the 15th episode talked about how he felt about his relationship in the States and how it was hard for him to give 5 positive feedbacks before criticizing someone. Because culturally, he was raised to criticize and be criticized in order to excel. And this new way somehow didn't make sense to him. According to research, business communications are different in different cultures. Anthropologist Edward T. Hall was among the first introducing the area of intercultural communication in 1950s at a Foreign Service Institute of U.S. Department of State because he noticed something profound. According to him and other cross-cultural experts, there are 2 main cultures based on the communication style: a low-context culture and a high-context culture. Low-context culture is one whose population has little to no shared background with one another. Countries with highest level of immigration, such as United States, Canada, and Western European countries fall into this category. In a low-context culture, effective communication is simple, detailed, and verbalized, or in a case of a contract, it is written and signed. Every little detail should be addressed in order to avoid future misunderstandings. If you ever bought a house in the States, you know what I mean. The contract is long and the paperwork is thick, and the process is lengthy. That's very different from what I am accustomed to back home. After all, we're living in a lowest context culture, according to Aaron Meyer, where an effective communication is explicit and verbalized. On the contrary, high context cultures are those with a strong shared history, such as East Asian, Latin American, and Southern Mediterranean countries. Because of their history, people raised in these cultures could develop many cues to understand one another without verbalizing it. This makes the communication rather more implicit. Silence, pause, gesture, words might have different meaning depending on how and where they are used. For example, in Hindi, kal aur parson means both tomorrow and yesterday. In Farsi, the word sheer has 3 different meanings: milk, lion, and faucet. It all depends on the context of how and where it is used. And this is not limited to Farsi or Hindi. Most languages spoken in the high context cultures have fewer words compared to English language. Why? Because they don't need it. I often compare the high context culture with a couple who've been married for 50 years. Rarely they need to say what they think, right? Their communication is rather understood. The cues they developed over the years, the way they look at one another, the tone of voice, or even the length of the silence tell the other person what they think and what they mean. Now compare that with a newly engaged couple. That might give you a better sense of high context versus low culture, right? Now, can you imagine someone born and raised in a high context culture migrating to the States and interacting with different cultures? What do you think might happen? According to research done by Aaron Meyer, 3 scenarios are plausible. High context interacting with high context interacting with low context, and low context interacting with low context. The latter, as you might imagine, has the lowest cross-cultural misunderstandings, since conversation is explicit, clear, discussed, and understood as is. On the contrary, the high context cultures interacting with high context cultures have the maximum level of misunderstandings, like a Japanese and Iranian working together, or a Russian and Korean becoming business partners. This is because the norms and the values that each learned back home is different. And because of their implicit communication styles, misunderstandings are unavoidable. Now, we're generalizing a bit, right? And not counting the different aspects of culture and the diversity within a population. Also, with an immigrant, we are not factoring in the integration process. Because as we integrate, we learn how to communicate like a low-context culture. In case of Layla, she was a high-context interacting with a low-context culture, as her boss was an American. In this scenario, the American might perceive the high-context culture secretive and someone unable to communicate. Remember the feedback she received from her boss? On the other hand, Layla perceived her boss as superficial, untrusting, and someone who stated the obvious. In Layla's case, she was often offended and puzzled by the number of times a concept was explained. She didn't understand why an email would follow a meeting outlining the actions when she was already working on them. She perceived the excessive communication as lack of trust in her ability to understand and follow the guidelines. She did the work without complaining, but she spent so much energy analyzing his boss's actions. And internally, she was very unhappy with her professional relationship. She often said, "I would go to the moon if I felt he cared about my work. If I felt he cared about my growth, or he trusted me with my work." This tells you how important the relationship is for someone coming from a high context culture. Again, think back to the importance of the relationship for a couple who've been together for 50 years. When a high context culture performance depends on trust in a relationship, the low context cultures usually build the trust based on the completed task. So according to Layla, her boss didn't trust her because she rarely communicated her progress. And Layla didn't trust him because he broke his promises and micromanaged her. Can you see the loop and the importance of the cultural awareness? In our work together, one thing I emphasized on was making sure Layla separates her work from herself. That's often the pitfall for those coming from high context cultures who haven't integrated successfully. Since trust and relationship are interdependent of one another, they assume once someone doesn't accept their work, this means they don't trust them and the relationship is weak. This is not true in a country with a low context culture. Rather, it's about your performance and the tasks that you complete. If you're someone who would take criticism and feedback personally, make sure you listen to our third episode. Nelson, who comes from one of the highest context cultures, talks about the importance of attitude, and he gives many suggestions on how not to take things personally and develop attitudes necessary to climb the corporate ladder. Another pitfall for those coming from high context cultures is reading between the lines. According to my experience, if you're interacting with a low context culture, almost nothing is said between the lines. Again, the conversation is as is and rather explicit. At times, you might be offended by how direct a comment is made or how openly they criticize you. I suggest not reading between the lines. And as Brené Brown in her book Dare to Lead explains, assume positive intent. You'd be shocked to know how this little tip improved people's quality of conversation. So assume positive intent. As Layla worked on these areas, her relationship with her boss grew stronger. He was a micromanager for sure, but she learned to interact with him effectively and as a result earn his trust. The next step was helping Layla to be able to say no. She worked really hard. She put in more hours than many of her colleagues did. She did the tasks that were neither within her scope of work nor supported her growth. This became a pressing issue when she was given 2 junior employees to lead. Every day she stayed overtime to complete their work, since she was the one accountable for the outcome. She was frustrated by how simply her employees shut down work because they had other things to do. This level of self-centeredness surprised her. Coming from a collective culture, Layla was focused on the unity and well-being of her team. She wanted to make sure that the team was being presented as strong and as united as possible, and would never single out an individual who didn't perform as promised. another cultural value, right? So instead of pushing them to deliver what was expected of them, she did the work for them. This meant more pressure on her, right? On the other hand, being raised in a hierarchical culture with a significant power difference, her boss was like a god to her. So she accepted every order and responsibility he passed on to her, which meant more pressure both on herself and her team. And since her team had no issue saying no, it meant more pressure on her. She felt disrespected, overwhelmed, underappreciated, and stressed. Understandably so, right? In order to solve this issue, we worked hard to find and develop some extra muscles, one of which was the egalitarian muscle. In most low-context cultures, the power is distributed equally. Again, we're generalizing a bit here, right? This means within an organization, one can openly discuss and share their view regardless of their rank. Coming from a hierarchical culture, this was unacceptable. The authority was established and the order was given top-down, and everyone assumed their responsibilities. No question asked. Balancing her hierarchical culture while developing her egalitarian muscle enabled Layla to push back on certain tasks. This reduced the pressure on her and her team, which enabled her to improve her work-life balance and improve her relationship with her team. This took a long time and intense weekly work. But knowing her drive and her determination, I was confident in the outcome. During our intense 2-year partnership, Layla achieved 3 main goals. She became a leader, managing a large team in her department. She is happily engaged and well compensated, and most importantly, she received her green card through her organization, which enabled her to visit her family after almost 6 years. Before the pandemic, she sent me her photo from Iran. She was at her grandparents' house, hugging her mom and her grandma. No words could describe the emotions I felt. Now, Layla was a brave woman. Many learn to tolerate the situation and complain inwardly. Do you remember I talked about that? That's a stage. In every scenario, you have a choice to complain or to confront and fix the issue at hand. I hope you choose the latter, especially now that the world is more tuned in to hear about minority and our cross-cultural obstacles for growth. Do talk. Do verbalize. Specifically. Clearly, and if you can offer a solution, do so. We in the States and many other low-context cultures are waiting to hear from you. What can the leaders and the system do to create opportunities for your growth? Write to me. Let me know. As someone passionate about this area, I would love to help you. As always, thank you for listening and sharing our immigrant stories with your friends and your colleagues. You, my audience, mean the world to me, and I know I will see you and your friends in the next episode of Empowering Conversations, where all of us can learn from successful immigrants, one conversation at a time.